Imagine this. Someone hurt you, not by accident, but with intent. They saw your kindness and used it. They knew your loyalty and exploited it. They watched how deeply you cared, and they turned it against you. And now, they're back. With apologies, promises, maybe even tears. They say they've changed. They say they're sorry. They want a second chance. And you're standing at a familiar crossroads, not between forgiveness and vengeance, but between self-respect and self-abandonment. Society tells you that second chances are noble, that compassion means letting people back in, that being a good person means tolerating harm with a smile. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Not everyone who says sorry deserves another seat at your table. And sometimes giving someone a second chance isn't compassion, it's betrayal of yourself. The Stoics didn't teach blind forgiveness. They taught discernment. They didn't tell us to be cold. They told us to be clear, to know the difference between a mistake and a pattern, to recognize when someone's actions are not just careless, but calculated, and to protect our inner peace with the same strength we once used to protect others. In this video, we're going to talk about why not everyone deserves a second chance. We'll break down the psychology of intentional harm. We'll explore how people weaponize your empathy, your silence, your need for closure. And we'll walk through what real emotional intelligence looks like. Not soft, not naive, but grounded, powerful, and deeply stoic. This isn't about holding a grudge. It's about holding the boundary. Because forgiveness is for you, but access is earned by them. Epictetus said, "Don't explain your philosophy, embody it. You don't need to fight. You don't need to beg. You don't even need to answer the phone. You just need to protect your peace like it's sacred. Because it is." If you've ever found yourself stuck between "give them one more chance" and "I've already seen enough," this message is for you. Let's begin. 1. Forgiveness isn't the same as reconnection. Forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing. But too often, people confuse them, sometimes on purpose. When someone hurts you, then shows up with an apology and asks for another chance, they're counting on your confusion. They want you to believe that if you've truly forgiven them, you'll let them back in. That if you don't, it means you're still bitter. But that's a lie. Forgiveness is about peace. Reconnection is about proof. Forgiveness is an internal decision. It's about releasing the emotional burden that came from their actions. It's for your mental clarity, your spiritual alignment, your growth. It means you stop carrying the weight of resentment. It means you accept what happened without letting it define who you are. But letting them back in? That's something entirely different. That's not about peace. That's about access. And access requires trust. Trust requires evidence, not promises, not apologies, evidence. Think of it like this. Imagine someone burns down your house. You rebuild from the ground up. It takes everything you have: time, energy, therapy, reflection, strength you didn't even know you had. Now, one day, the person comes back saying, "I've changed. Let me in." Do you give them the keys again? Of course not. That's not cruelty. That's wisdom. That's the natural result of learning. Stoicism teaches us to act with reason, not impulse, with virtue, not guilt. So let's get clear. You can forgive someone in your heart and still block them from your life. You can wish them healing from afar without inviting them to dinner. You can say, "I wish you well," and also say, "I no longer have a place for you here." That's not holding a grudge. That's holding a boundary. And boundaries are what protect the healed version of you from the chaos that broke the old one. Here's where people get manipulated. They're told that forgiveness requires closeness, that if you really let it go, you'll reconnect. That peace means pretending nothing ever happened. But that's emotional gaslighting. True Stoic peace comes from clarity, not denial. We don't pretend the fire never happened. We just stop sitting in the ashes. Let me give you a real-world example. A woman I once coached had a best friend she'd known since childhood. They'd been through everything together, birthdays, breakups, family drama. But during a particularly painful season in her life, that friend betrayed her deeply. Shared her private struggles with others, mocked her behind her back, made her vulnerability into gossip. When confronted, the friend cried, apologized, and begged for a second chance. "You're like a sister to me," she said. "You can't just cut me off." The woman was torn. She loved her friend. She missed her. But she also remembered how deeply it hurt to be betrayed like that. She came to me and said, "If I forgive her, doesn't that mean I should let her back into my life?" I told her what I'll tell you now. Forgiveness is a release. Reconnection is a reward. If someone wants access to the version of you that took years to rebuild, they need to show you consistently that they've changed. They don't get to walk back in just because they feel bad. Remorse is not the same as transformation. And let's be honest, most people aren't sorry they hurt you. They're sorry they lost you. They're not grieving the pain they caused. They're grieving the comfort they lost, the access, the control. And when they cry or plead or remind you of everything we've been through, what they're really saying is, "Let me in again. Let me try again." With the same patterns, the same behaviors, the same emotional weapons. Well, the Stoic way is not to hate, but it is to see clearly. Clarity is not cruelty. It's responsibility. And here's a truth that might sting. When you forgive someone and immediately let them back in, without evidence of change, what you're really doing is betraying yourself. You're saying, "My peace is negotiable. My growth can be reset. My boundaries are flexible," when guilt is involved. That's not virtue. That's vulnerability. The dangerous kind. Seneca once said, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it." And I can't think of a greater waste than giving multiple chances to someone who only ever needed one to show you who they truly are. You don't owe anyone multiple opportunities to harm you. You don't need to see the good in them when their actions scream otherwise. You don't need to let someone back in just because you have history. History doesn't entitle someone to your present, and it certainly doesn't guarantee them a future. So the next time someone says, "If you really forgave me, you give me another chance," respond with this: "I did forgive you. That's why I'm at peace. But I no longer trust you with access to me." That's Stoic strength. That's emotional intelligence. That's self-respect. Let them think you're cold. Let them call you harsh. Let them spin their version of the story. None of that matters. What matters is that you no longer abandon yourself in the name of keeping someone else comfortable. Because that's not growth. That's regression. And you didn't come this far just to repeat the cycle. 2. How to recognize intentional harm. Let's be honest. Most people want to believe the best in others. We want to think, maybe they didn't mean it, or they were just having a bad day. And sometimes that's true. We all say things in anger, forget promises, or fall short. But Stoicism teaches us not to judge people by isolated events, but by patterns. And when someone consistently hurts you, manipulates you, or crosses your boundaries, that's not confusion. That's a strategy. One of the most dangerous things you can do in life is excuse deliberate harm as accidental. When someone lies to you, repeatedly, undermines your confidence, and distorts your perception of reality, that's not poor communication. That's psychological warfare. It's what the Stoics would call the corruption of character. And your job is not to fix it. Your job is to see it for what it is. People who harm with intent don't always come with red flags waving. Sometimes they smile when they wound you. Sometimes they use soft words while they twist the knife. They often act loving in public and cruel in private. And that's what makes it so dangerous. Because the damage doesn't come from sudden explosions. It comes from repeated micro-wounds, silent betrayals, manipulation wrapped in kindness. You must pay attention to patterns. One lie may be a slip. 5 lies, that's intention. One broken promise, maybe they forgot. Repeated broken promises, that's disregard. When someone continues to make choices that benefit them and harm you, you're not dealing with confusion. You're dealing with clarity you're afraid to accept. Here's what you need to know. People don't accidentally gaslight you. They don't accidentally play the victim every time you stand up for yourself. They don't accidentally make you doubt your own memory, your emotions, or your worth. These are patterns of control, not one-time lapses in judgment. And when they're caught, they usually follow the same script. First, they minimize. You're being too sensitive. Then they shift blame. Well, if you hadn't done this, then they cry. I've just been going through so much. Then they ask for another chance. Let's start over. Sound familiar? That's not growth. That's performance. That's someone who doesn't want accountability. They want access. And they've learned that your empathy is a weakness they can use as a key. Let me share a real-world example. A man I knew had been dating someone for nearly 2 years. She constantly made sarcastic comments about his appearance, dismissed his achievements, and isolated him from his friends. Whenever he brought it up, she'd say, "You're overreacting," or worse, "You're just too sensitive." Over time, he started believing her. He questioned his reactions. He felt guilty for standing up for himself. It wasn't until a close friend pointed out, "She never talks to you that way when other people are around," that he woke up. That's the thing about intentional harm. It's often disguised. It doesn't look like abuse. It looks like jokes, like passive aggression, like tough love. But your soul knows. Your gut feels it. And your job as a Stoic is to trust what your peace is trying to tell you. Seneca said, "A sword never kills anybody. It is a tool in the killer's hand." In the same way, their words may seem harmless, but it's the intent behind them that slices deep. You must learn to see beyond appearances, to stop listening to what people say, and start observing what they consistently do. Here's a checklist. Do they take responsibility without making excuses? Or do they always have a reason for why it wasn't their fault? Do they change their behavior or just change the tone of their apology? Do they act differently around others than they do with you? Do you feel safer after they apologize, or more confused? Because real remorse leads to real change. Real accountability is uncomfortable. It requires humility, consistency, and patience. But people who harm intentionally rarely want discomfort. They want shortcuts. They want access without change. And if you're not vigilant, they'll manipulate your compassion into a leash you tie around your own neck. Stoicism teaches us to train the mind, to think clearly under pressure, to strip away illusion, to judge not based on hope, but on what is. And if someone's actions repeatedly cause you harm, no amount of history, chemistry, or promises should override that reality. Let's stop pretending every hurt is unintentional. Let's stop sugarcoating betrayal. Let's stop telling ourselves maybe they didn't know better, when the truth is, they knew exactly where your boundaries were, and they walked over them anyway. You can't heal what you refuse to name, so call it what it is, not a misunderstanding, not a rough patch, not a toxic relationship. Call it a pattern of deliberate harm, and treat it like the fire it is. Because if you don't, you'll keep walking into the same flames, hoping this time it won't burn. 3. Why silence is the strongest response. In a world addicted to noise, silence is a power most people never learn to wield. But Stoics knew its value. They knew that silence isn't emptiness, it's a message. It says, I see what you've done, and I no longer owe you my words, my time, or my energy. When someone harms you intentionally, the most powerful thing you can do is not scream, not argue, not explain. It's to go quiet. And not out of fear, but out of clarity. Because when you've seen someone's true nature, there's nothing left to negotiate. Toxic people thrive on reaction. They poke, provoke, manipulate, not because they want resolution, but because they want control. Your pain is their leverage. Your need to be understood is their opening. If they can make you react, they can still write the narrative. But when you go silent, you cut off their oxygen. They expect a fight. They expect you to justify your decision, to argue, cry, rage, or beg, because that tells them they still matter, that you're still emotionally tethered. So when you offer nothing, no closure, no breakdown, no dramatic goodbye, they panic. Your silence becomes the echo of your power. Let me be clear, silence is not passive. It's not avoidance, it's not suppression. Silence, when used with intention, is discipline in its purest form. It's the Stoic sword sheathed, not because it can't cut, but because it doesn't need to. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "The best revenge is not to be like your enemy." That's what silence is. It's the refusal to be baited into their chaos. It's a boundary wrapped in calm. It's you saying, I've risen above this, and I don't need to explain my altitude. Let me share a real story. A woman I worked with was in a relationship with a man who constantly guilt-tripped her. Every time she asserted a boundary, he'd flip the script. He'd say things like, "You're abandoning me," or "You never cared." And for years she'd respond. She'd explain herself. She'd try to soothe him. Until one day, after a final betrayal, she simply said nothing. No fight, no explanation, just silence. Days passed, then weeks. He called, texted, emailed, accused her of being cold, unforgiving, heartless. But her silence wasn't cruelty, it was clarity. And in that silence, she healed. Because every word she didn't send was a declaration, I no longer owe you access to my peace. This is what Stoicism teaches us. Emotional control is not about numbing your feelings. It's about choosing what you give your energy to. And when someone has shown they will twist your words, weaponize your empathy, and use your explanations against you, the wisest thing you can do is stop feeding the fire. Silence also strips away their mask. Because without your emotional response to deflect onto, they're forced to face themselves. They can't spin your stillness. They can't argue with your absence. All that's left is the truth. And that's what terrifies them the most. You don't owe anyone a speech to validate your decision. You don't need to write a 5-paragraph essay about why you're walking away. Your silence says, I've already said enough, with my boundaries, with my choices, and now with my absence.
And make no mistake, they hear it.
They feel it. People always hear the silence of someone who once gave them everything. It rings louder than any scream ever could. Here's the paradox. The more you evolve, the less you explain. The stronger you become, the softer your exit. The more peace you cultivate, the quieter your energy. That's not weakness. That's sovereignty. Seneca said, sometimes even to live is an act of courage. In our world today, to be quiet in the face of provocation is one of the greatest acts of strength, because it means you're no longer reacting from trauma. You're responding from truth. Now let's address what many people fear. If I go silent, will they think I don't care? Will they think they won? That's the wrong question. The right question is, why does their opinion still matter to someone who harmed me? Silence isn't about what they think. It's about what you know. You know who they are. You know what they did. You know what you deserve. That's enough. When you've reached a point where you no longer seek validation, no longer need closure, no longer crave a final word, you are free. Free from their emotional grip. Free from the need to be understood by someone committed to misunderstanding you. And when they reach out again, and they will, remember this. You don't have to respond. You don't have to reopen the chapter you already closed. You don't have to light another match just to prove you've moved on. Because you already have. That's the Stoic way. We don't slam doors. We don't shout in anger. We don't retaliate to prove a point. We walk away quietly, with dignity. And in our silence, we carry the loudest truth of all. I choose my peace over your chaos. I choose my future over your past. I choose me. 4. Not everyone deserves the healed version of you. You've done the work. You've sat in the quiet, felt the pain, peeled back every layer of your own story. You've cried, reflected, journaled, meditated, screamed into pillows. You've rebuilt your self-respect one boundary at a time. And now, here they come. The same person who broke you shows up at your door, not with a changed soul, but with a changed tone. Softer voice, gentler words, apologies on their lips. I see your worth now, they say. Let's start over. But here's what they don't understand. They don't deserve to meet the healed version of you. The version they knew, the one who over-explained, who bent backwards, who tolerated the chaos just to keep the peace. That version is gone. You buried them in the ashes of that last betrayal, and what stands in their place is someone who finally gets it. Healing isn't about going back. It's about never allowing what broke you to return. You see, the Stoics understood that self-mastery requires self-protection. Epictetus said, "First say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do." You decided to become whole, and that wholeness is not community property. It's sacred ground. It's not a public park where anyone who once visited gets to come back and pitch a tent. It's a private sanctuary, and not everyone gets a key. The problem is, when you heal, you glow. You radiate confidence, clarity, and calm. And people who once used your wounds to control you now sense the shift. They no longer have leverage, so they try a new angle. They show up as changed. But if you look closely, you'll notice something. The behavior is the same, only the packaging has evolved. They're still inconsistent, still manipulative, still vague. But now, instead of lashing out, they say things like, "I've been doing inner work." Instead of blaming, they say, "I'm just trying to grow." It sounds different, but the outcomes are the same. You walk away drained, confused, questioning yourself again. That's not growth. That's rebranding. And your peace is not a testing ground for their self-image experiment. Here's a truth we don't say enough. Healing doesn't make you available again. It makes you wiser. It gives you discernment. It creates filters. Just because you've moved on doesn't mean they're entitled to move back in. Just because you've let go of the pain doesn't mean you've forgotten the pattern. When someone says, "I miss you," ask yourself, do they miss you? Or do they miss having access to you? Do they miss your soul? Or the control they had over it? Because anyone can miss the light you brought into their life. That doesn't mean they deserve to bask in it again. Let me give you a real story. A client of mine spent 3 years recovering from a relationship with someone who gaslit her daily. The emotional abuse was subtle but relentless. When she finally left, she spent the next year healing, reading philosophy, doing therapy, rediscovering herself. Her life changed. She started to smile again, breathe again. She built a business, found community, learned peace. And just as she began thriving, he texted, "I see the woman you've become. I want back in." But she was no longer the woman who would entertain that kind of message. She didn't respond with bitterness or even anger. She simply replied, "The woman you're seeing now exists because I healed from what you did. She's not someone you get to meet." And that was it. That was her boundary. That was her power. You don't owe access to people who helped destroy the version of you that had no boundaries. You don't have to let someone re-enter just because they finally recognize your value. Recognition isn't redemption. Regret isn't repair. And desire isn't transformation. Stoicism isn't just about staying calm. It's about staying grounded. It's about living according to principle, not pressure. And no principle is more important than protecting the peace you fought to create. Seneca warned against giving your time, and by extension, your soul, to those who waste it. He said, "People are frugal in guarding their personal property, but as soon as it comes to squandering time, they are most wasteful of the one thing in which it is right to be stingy." Your healed self is the result of time, effort, pain, growth, and clarity. Don't waste it on déjà vu. Letting someone back into your life isn't noble if they haven't done the work. It's not kind. It's not generous. It's dangerous because it sends a message to your own subconscious that your boundaries are flexible, that your standards are optional, that your evolution is for everyone's benefit, even those who set it in motion through harm. No. This version of you, it's reserved for those who honor it, who earn it, who meet it with integrity, not nostalgia, with growth, not excuses, with humility, not entitlement. You are not cruel for saying no. You are not bitter for enforcing distance. You are not heartless for protecting what you've built inside of you. You are simply applying the lessons you paid for. And that, my friend, is what Stoic strength looks like. Forgiveness with conditions. How to set boundaries without losing your peace. Forgiveness is powerful, but forgiveness without boundaries is dangerous. That's the line most people miss, and the one Stoicism draws clearly. Because the goal of forgiveness is peace, and you cannot have peace if you don't protect what you've healed. Too often we're told that true forgiveness means total reconciliation, that if you've really let go, you'll reconnect, re-engage, resume. But that's not forgiveness. That's denial. Forgiveness is internal. Boundaries are external. One sets you free, the other keeps you free. The Stoics understood this duality. Epictetus said, "Keep your will in harmony with nature." And nature tells us that recovery requires distance. Even a wounded animal withdraws to heal. The idea that you must sit next to the person who hurt you in order to prove you've forgiven them? That's not virtue. That's conditioning. You are allowed to forgive someone and still never speak to them again. You're allowed to release resentment and still close the door. You're allowed to bless them from afar and never give them another second of your presence. That's not bitterness. That's discernment. And discernment is emotional maturity in action. Let me give you a clear example. A man's father abandoned him as a child, disappeared for decades, then reappeared in his late 30s full of apologies. I was young. I didn't know better. Can we build a relationship now? The man forgave him. Truly, he felt lighter. He no longer held on to the anger. But he also didn't invite him into his life. No birthdays, no family dinners, just peace. Why? Because forgiveness does not obligate reconnection. It releases the poison, but does not reopen the wound. In Stoic philosophy, boundaries are not walls of resentment, they're fences of wisdom. They're how we protect our values, our energy, and our clarity. The problem is, many people will try to guilt you when you enforce them. But I said I was sorry. Why are you being so cold? I thought you moved on. And here's what you must remember. You don't need to justify your boundaries to those they're meant to protect you from. You can be kind and still say no. You can be compassionate and still walk away. You can be deeply spiritual and still block their number. In fact, that might be the most spiritual thing you do all year. Because when you allow repeat violators back into your space without evidence of change, you're not showing love. You're showing self-neglect. And if you abandon yourself to make someone else feel better about what they did, that's not empathy. That's emotional betrayal from within. The world romanticizes unconditional love. But Stoicism teaches something deeper: unconditional clarity. You can love someone and still know they're not good for your nervous system. You can care about someone and still recognize that their access to you is a privilege, not a right. Let's make this simple. Forgiveness is for you. Boundaries are for both of you. One clears your heart, the other protects your soul. And the best part? You can enforce boundaries without hostility. You don't have to slam doors or burn bridges. You don't have to announce your detachment with dramatic exits. A quiet shift in access is more than enough. They'll notice. Stoics aren't loud about closure. We don't yell, "I'm done," in the middle of the storm. We just stop opening the door. We don't explain our limits 100 times. We simply stop letting people cross them. You can say things like, "I forgive you, and I'm moving forward alone. I'm at peace. I'm just not open to rebuilding this connection. I've healed. That version of me no longer exists." No anger, no resentment, just truth. Clean, quiet, final. There's a beauty in that kind of boundary. It doesn't seek revenge. It seeks order. And Stoicism, at its core, is about living in harmony with the natural order, starting with the emotional ecosystem inside yourself. Seneca once wrote, "He who forgives easily invites offense." What he meant was this: forgiveness without standards signals tolerance of harm. It tells people they can break something sacred and expect the door to still be open. That's not strength. That's spiritual negligence. So here's your challenge. Forgive boldly, but set boundaries even more boldly. Be soft-hearted, but steel-spined. Wish them well, but from a distance that protects your wellness. And remember this above all. You don't owe access to anyone who hurt you just because you're no longer hurting. Forgiveness isn't saying come back. It's saying I'm free. And sometimes the only way to stay free is to keep the door closed.
6.
The healing journey and the power of not looking back. Healing isn't a moment, it's a slow becoming. It's the quiet, daily decision to no longer betray yourself, to no longer open your heart to what repeatedly tore it. And the final step in that journey? It's not forgiveness. It's not even peace. It's the ability to walk forward without looking back. The world tells us closure comes from conversations, from apologies, from final words and mutual understanding. But Stoicism teaches something different. Real closure doesn't come from them. It comes from you. From your decision to no longer need anything from the person who hurt you. Not their validation, not their regret, not their explanation, nothing. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." And that's what choosing not to look back is. The strength to stop chasing resolution from people who were never willing to give you honesty in the first place. When you stop checking their page. When you stop replaying old memories. When you stop crafting what you'd say if you saw them again. That's freedom. That's growth. That's closure. Here's what many people struggle to accept. Not everyone gets a goodbye. Some people exit your life with unfinished sentences, unpaid debts, unspoken lies. And that's okay, because the truth is some chapters are meant to end quietly, not with a bang, but with the closing of a door only you can hear. The Stoic doesn't chase justice in every interaction. We chase clarity. We chase virtue. We chase the kind of peace that doesn't depend on anyone else's behavior. So when someone asks you, why didn't you give them another chance? You don't owe a debate. You owe yourself peace. Let me share one final story. A woman I once mentored left a long-term relationship with someone who constantly manipulated her. Subtle lies, silent treatments, emotional blackmail. She worked hard to heal, went to therapy, learned Stoic principles, rebuilt her life. Months later, he messaged her. "I've changed. Let's talk." And for the first time, she didn't respond. Not because she was angry, not because she was bitter, but because she had nothing left to say. That was her freedom. That was her strength. The most powerful sentence she never said was, "I forgive you, but I no longer care to include you in the rest of my story." When you reach that point, not the one where you hate them, but the one where you've truly outgrown them, you don't need revenge. You don't need them to admit they were wrong. You've already won by refusing to lose yourself again. Looking back doesn't heal the wound. It reopens it. Every time you replay their apology, their excuse, their explanation, you delay your own resurrection. And you've come too far to return to the place where your self-worth was negotiable. Stoic wisdom teaches us this: you are not what happened to you. You are what you choose to become after. And you become free not by editing the past, but by refusing to let it own your future. So no, you don't owe them one more talk. You don't owe them one more chance. You don't owe them the healed version of you. What you owe is to yourself. You owe yourself the right to move forward without guilt, to enforce boundaries without apology, to let silence be the final chapter, and to let peace, not pain, be the reason you keep going. Because healing doesn't always mean things end neatly. It just means you've learned enough to not repeat the lesson. So walk on. With dignity, with clarity, with quiet power. Let them wonder. Let them imagine. Let them rewrite the story if they want. But you keep writing a new one. One where the main character finally saves themselves. That's not just healing. That's liberation. And you've earned it.